All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, the host of the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series. And we're here today with Dr. Riccardo Ginevra, who's a current fellow at, not physically at the Center for Hellenic Studies, but has been a fellow this spring, doing research on the hymn to Demeter, the Greek myth of Kore and Demeter. And you're going to talk with us today about that project as it's been happening. Let's see. I'll just ask you my ritual question, which is, could you tell us a bit about what first interested you in the classical world?
Well, actually, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation and for the presentation. Well, to be honest, it was mythology. When I was a little kid, I started reading this book about Greek mythology, and I got fascinated. I was fascinated. I got interested into it. So I guess that, and I also started reading books about other mythologies of the world. So so now I'm doing some classical studies and some comparative mythology still after 30 years. So I guess I never grew up.
Right. I remember those days of reading mythology. We had to read it in school, actually, as well. But anyway, I won't reminisce. Thank you for sharing yours. So go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to share my presentation. So today we're going to discuss some research on the connection between comparative mythology and folktale studies. More specifically, we're going to discuss the myths of Kore and Demeter and Baldr, and their connection with the fairy tales of the type Sleeping Beauty. This research is part of my project, The Poetics of Distress in the European Phraseology and Themes in the American to Demeter, funded by the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. And the aim of the project is to understand if, and if yes, to what extent, the Greek myth of Kore, Persephone, and Demeter, especially as attested in the Homeric hymn, may reflect what Greg Nudge calls the Hellenization of Indo-European poetics, myth, and ritual. That is the specific development within a Greek context of inherited features of poetic language, mythical narratives, and ritual practice. Let's start by introducing our myths, the myths of Demeter and Baldr, which I call Indo-European myths of non-functioning deities. In a publication which just came out, I tried to compare the ancient Greek myth of Kore, Persephone's rape, and Demeter's rage, and other myths, Indo-European myths of non-functioning deities, among which is the Scandinavian myth of Baldr's death, which is mostly attested by medieval sources in the Old Norse language, like the Eddic poems the Spau and the prose Edda by Icelandic mythographer Snorri Sturluson. Now, you probably all know the plot of the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter's daughter Persephone is kidnapped by Hades, Lord of the Dead. Demeter searches for her but cannot find her. So enraged, but at some point she finds out that she has been kidnapped. So Demeter is, of course, angry and leaves the company of the gods, taking the shape of an old woman, and eventually arrives at the palace of the kings of Eleusis, Keleus and Metaneira. Then we have the Demophon episode that we will discuss right away. But as you all know, eventually a cosmic winter, Demeter makes a cosmic winter threaten the existence of humanity itself. So Zeus takes action and sends Hermes to get Kore back from Hades. But Hades forces Kore to eat a pomegranate seed, which forces her to spend half of the year with her mother, and that's what we call spring, and the other half with Hades, and that's what we call winter. The pomegranate seed is a strange detail, which we will discuss later on, and which also inspired this beautiful painting by Rossetti, which I use as a cover for my presentation. The Norse myth of Baldr's death, especially in the version, in Snorri's version, goes as follows. The god Baldr fears for his life, so precautions are taken which fail, and we will discuss this later. Eventually, Baldr is killed by a mistletoe twig, which is thrown by his brother Hödur, and Baldr's death is the unluckiest deed that ever happened among gods and mortals. His mother, Frigg, sends the god Hermodur to bring Baldr back from hell, which is not a Christian hell, but it's the Norse realm of the dead. In the end, all efforts to bring Baldr back from the dead fail, but in the end of time, Baldr will come back, and cornfields will grow without sowing. Now, today we're going to compare this myth with the modern folktale Sleeping Beauty, classified as ATU 410. In a publication from last year, I proposed to compare the so-called Demophon episode of the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the beginning of Baldr's myth with the beginning of the folk tales of the type ATU 410, known as Sleeping Beauty. Now, the Demophon episode takes place right after Demeter, enraged for her daughter's disappearance, arrives at Eleusis and is asked to nurse Demophon by his royal parents, Chilius and Metaneira. I believe that the multiple elements can be seen to be shared between these narratives. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the prince of Eleusis, Demophon, which means he who shines on the people, is conceived late and beyond hope. The kings and queen, who are his parents, are concerned regarding his safety, so they ask Demeter, who is disguised as an old woman, to ensure the safety of the prince by making him invulnerable from anything that may hurt him. The attempt is, of course, unsuccessful, like all attempts at invulnerability in mythology and fairy tales, and is associated with an oath. So in the end, Demophon remains mortal. At the beginning of Baldr's myth, Baldr, which probably means the Shining One, is the son of the kings of the gods, Odin and Frigg, who are concerned for his safety because his doom has been prophesied. So Frigg, his mother, attempts to ensure the safety of Baldr by making him invulnerable from anything that may hurt him. And this attempt is also associated with an oath, and it is, of course, unsuccessful because Baldr, in the end, is wounded and killed. The initial situation of the fairy tales of the type ATU 410, so Sleeping Beauty, go as follows, as you know. A princess, which in Disney's version is called Aurora, which means dawn, is conceived late and beyond hope. So her parents, the king and queen, attempt to ensure the safety of the princess by protecting her from anything that may hurt her. And this attempt is associated with a public decree, according to which all spindles in the kingdom must be destroyed. Of course, the attempt, as you know, is unsuccessful because the princess eventually does touch a spindle and meets her own doom. So, some shared elements can be recognized. The mythical characters and the folktale princess have names associated with light and are conceived late and beyond hope. After concerns arise for their safety, and we have a prophecy of doom both in Baldr's myth and in the folktales, an attempt is made to ensure the safety of the characters by protecting them from the things that may hurt them. And this attempt is associated with official verbal declarations. In myth, we have an oath, and in the folktales, a public decree. This attempt is, of course, unsuccessful, and in the end, the mythical characters and the folktale princesses stay vulnerable and eventually meet their doom. So, the question that we are trying to answer today is, may further parallels be identified between the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the myth of Baldr, and the Sleeping Beauty folktales? And more importantly, are these parallels useful at all? Do they help us with the interpretation of the hymn? To answer this question, we're going to use a methodology developed by Vladimir Prop in his Morphology of the Folk Tale in the 20s, which is a semiotic narratological approach which has 4 basic theses, but we only care about the first 3. First of all, functions of characters serve as stable, constant elements in a tale, independent of how and by whom they are fulfilled. Secondly, the number of functions known to the fairy tale is limited, and precisely there are 31. Thirdly, the sequence of functions is always identical, but they may be repeated, always in the same order, and they can also be assimilated. This approach is a type of structural analysis, which was originally developed within linguistics, and which allows us to recognize both syntagmatic relationships between single events in a given tale, which is what in syntax. So in syntax, you have a syntagmatic relationship between words in a given sentence. For instance, in English, I have a bottle. But it also allows us to recognize paradigmatic relationships between elements which can be substituted for one another in different versions of a given tale. So we have different versions which have the same structure, just like in the lexicon, you have a paradigmatic relationship between words which belong to the same class, for instance, nouns and adjectives. For instance, in the English sentence, I have a bottle and I have a pen, you have 2 sentences with different meanings, but with the same structure, because bottle and pen are in a paradigmatic relationship with one another. We will also make some use of Steve Thompson's Index of Folktale Motifs, which is a list of elements which are attested in many folktales all over the world. So today we shall analyze Sleeping Beauty in the versions by Perrault and Green according to the props 31 functions, and we will see if we can find any parallels in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Remember that not all functions must occur, but when they do, they always occur in the same order, except for repetitions and assimilations. And when appropriate, we will also take into account the Indo-European myth of Baldr. So in the folktales, functions are preceded by an initial situation, which doesn't occur in the Homeric hymn, but it does, at least not at the beginning of the Homeric hymn, but the initial situation of the Sleeping Beauty parallels the Demophon episode, which only starts in line 212. The reason for this is that the Homeric hymn to Demeter is actually made up of 3 separate episodes, and the Demophon episode is the central one, whereas it can have it, and it can therefore have its own new initial situation. So let's start right away with the first function, which is absentation, in which one of the members of a family absents himself from home. And prop tells us that the person absenting himself can be a member of the older generation, so a parent, for instance. I will always mention the name of the function and the definition, just like prop does in the morphology, and I will also quote some parts of his morphology. So, both in the folktale and in the myth, the parents of the main characters leave them alone. In the folktale, the king and queen leave the princess alone. In the myth, Demeter has left Cory alone. So, in the Brothers Grimm's Dornröschen, which from now on we will call Grimm's version, the king and queen were not at home, and the maiden was left in the palace quite alone. In Charles Perrault's La Belle au Bois dormant, which from now on we will call Perrault's version, the king and queen were gone to one of their holiday houses. And the Homeric hymn to Demeter starts right away telling us that Cory was playing apart from Demeter, the lady of the golden sword and glorious fruits. Then we can jump to function 7, complicity, in which the victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. Remember that not all functions must occur in each tale, so we can jump from the first function to the 7th function. It is actually unusual for all functions to occur in each tale, and it's almost impossible for this first initial part of the tale.
Actually, Riccardo, could I ask you a question at this point? You said that everything occurs in the same order except for repetitions and assimilations. Repetitions, I think I can understand. It's a retelling of something that happened before. But what do you mean by assimilation as an exception to the rule of order?
Sometimes the same event can have 2 functions. So basically, it can fulfill both function, let's say 7 or a 9, and function 10. So that's an example of simulation. Yeah.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. So function 7, prop tells us that in function 7, the hero mechanically reacts to the employment of magical means, which is exactly what happens in the folktale and the myth, in which, amazed by what they see as a toy, the characters reach for it. So the princess in the folktale sees a spindle and playfully reaches for it. In the myth, Cory sees a flower, a narcissus, and playfully reaches for it. In Grimm's version, the princess goes around and she has never seen a spindle because, of course, they're all being destroyed because of the royal decree. And suddenly she sees an old woman spinning and asks her, "What sort of thing is that that rattles round so merrily?" And she took the spindle and wanted to spin too. And basically the same thing happens in Perrault's version as well. So in Demeter's myth, Cory sees a narcissus, a flower, and she's so amazed that she reaches out with both hands to take the lovely toy, Calo Naturma. And the narcissus also gives us the occasion to discuss one of Steve Thompson's folktale motifs, D1364-3, in which a plant becomes a hero's doom. A plant which is usually magic and also described wonderfully because of its color, of its smell, of its height. And that's what happens in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in which the narcissus, which Earth made to grow to be as Nea for Cory, the bloom-like girl, was a thing of awe for gods and mortal men to see. From its root grew 100 blooms, and it smelled most sweetly. And and this also gives us a parallel it also has a parallel in the Norse myth, in which Baldr is killed by means of a mistletoe, which is described just as wonderfully as the Narcissus in the Greek myth, as you can see in the following passage, in which the mistletoe is described as famous and fair in the lofty fields, full grown in strength, so slender and fair. And if you've ever seen a mistletoe, this is not a normal description for one. Then we have function 8, villainy, in which the villain causes harm or injury to a member of a family. Prop tells us that the first seven functions are actually the preparatory part of the tale, but the real tale, the real development begins with an act of villainy, whose forms can be exceedingly varied and often can entail 2 or 3 harmful acts at once. Then Prop gives us a long list of types of villainy, and it's interesting to notice that many of them are attested both by our folktales and our myths. The princess is pricked by the spindle, which is number 6, bodily injury in Prop's list, which makes her fall into a magical sleep. Number 11, the villain casts a spell. In the myth, Kore is abducted. Number 1, the villain abducts a person. Disappears from Earth. Number 7, the villain causes a sudden disappearance. Detained in the underworld. Number 15, the villain imprisons or detains someone. And forcefully married by Hades. Number 16, the villain threatens forced matrimony. In the Norse myth, Baldr is pierced by a mistletoe twig, again number 6 in Prop's list, and killed. Number 14, the villain commits murder. So in Grimm's version, in the very moment when the princess felt the prick of the spindle, she fell down upon the bed and lay in a deep sleep. And the same happens in Perrault's version. In the Demeter's myth, as soon as Kore reaches for the Narcissus, the wide path air gapes open and Hades comes out and seizes rape by force and drives her off on his golden car. In the Norse myth, the mistletoe twig flies through him, through Baldr, and Baldr falls dead to the earth. So let's jump now to another episode, the Demophon episode. If you remember, the Demophon episode is one of 3 separate episodes in the Homeric Inn, so we can repeat functions now. And remember that the first part of the Demophon episode corresponds to the initial situation of the Sleeping Beauty folktale. Now, in the Homeric Inn to Demeter, the kings of Eleusis, the parents of the prince Demophon, had asked Demeter, who was disguised as an old woman, to ensure the safety of the prince. And the attempt is unsuccessful. So, more precisely, the unsuccessful attempt involves Demeter burning Demophon on the fire ritually. And of course, the ritual fails when Metaneira interrupts it because, of course, she's concerned for her child's safety. So, again, we have complicity now. More specifically, both in the folktale and in the myth, a character is surprised after looking into another chamber and seeing an old woman doing something they do not understand. So in the folktale, the princess looks into a chamber and sees an old woman spinning, and she's never seen one. In the myth, Metaneira, the queen of Eleusis, is surprised after looking into another chamber and seeing an old woman, who is Demeter in disguise, burning Demophon in the fire. And that's basically what happens. So I guess we can go right away to the villainy. Again, repeated function. Both in the folktale and in the myth, this leads to a catastrophe and after which a character falls unconscious. As you know, the princess touches the spindle and falls unconscious, asleep. In the myth, Queen Metaneira screams and stops Demeter from performing the ritual, so from making Demophon invulnerable. And in the end, Demophon, of course, Demeter screams that Demophon will die at some point, he will never be immortal. She reveals her own divine nature, and Metaneira is shocked and faints. And that's, again, what happens here. In the end, you can read, Demeter says, now there's no way Demophon can escape death and the fates, and therefore his mother, Metaneira, fainted. Her knees were bruised. This leads us to our 9th function, mediation, the connective incident in which the misfortune is made known, and often the hero is dispatched somewhere. We have a series of interesting parallels between the folktales and the myths here. Let's have a look at them. The first one is that right after the villainy, someone is unable to react to the misfortune, and then someone cries, people hear and come from other rooms. They try to help, but they do not succeed. So in Perrault's version, right after the princess falls asleep, the good old woman doesn't know very well what to do in this affair. So she cries out for help, and people come in from every quarter in great numbers. And they threw water upon the princess's face. They unlaced her, they struck her on the palms, they rubbed her temples with hungry water. But nothing would bring her to herself. So they tried to help, but they didn't succeed. In the Homeric hymn, the Queen Metaneira faints, and then she remains speechless for a long while, not remembering to take up her late-born son from the ground. But Demophon screams, and his sisters hear his pitiful wailing and spring down from the well-spread beds. And they try to help, because one of them takes the child in her hands and lays in her bosom. Another revives the fire, and they gathered about the struggling child, and they washed him and they embraced him lovingly, but he was not comforted, because nurses and handmaids, much less skillful than Demeter, were holding him now. So again, someone cries, people hear and come from other rooms, they try to help, they do not succeed. And something similar happens in the Norse myth as well. Then we have the king, who is also the father, who learning about the misfortune and understanding the implication. In Perrault's version, the king, who had heard the prediction of this misfortune by fairies, he remembers the prediction and he judges very well to do something else. But most interestingly, in Demeter's myth, Celeus' daughters told powerful Celeus, so the king of Eleusis and father of Demophon, all things without fail, as Demeter had instructed them, which is very interesting because they actually weren't there while Demeter was speaking. If you remember, Demeter leaves the room, Metaneira faints, and then after she faints, his sisters hear his pitiful wailing and spring down from their well-spread beds. Now, this is an example of what Prop tells us about what can happen when functions follow one another, but are performed by different characters. The second characters must know all that has taken place up to that time. So sometimes characters even act as if they are all-knowing. So in this case, Celeus' daughters clearly are all-knowing. And in the Norse myth, for some reason, Odin is the one who has the best perception of what great harm the death of Baldr would be. Then the king commands his people to transport the character's lifeless body away to a dedicated place, or just the character. So in Perrault's version, the king caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace. In Demeter's myth, Celeus calls an assembly and tells them to build a nice temple for Demeter. And in Baldr's myth, the gods take the body of Baldr and bring it to the sea, where they carry it on a ship and then they perform a typical Viking funeral. What happens next is perhaps more interesting. The character is left there undisturbed and separated from the world, waiting for the moment she can join her loved ones again. And in Perrault's version, the king tells everyone that no one should disturb the princess, but they should let her sleep quietly until her hour of awakening was come. And in Demeter's myth, as soon as the building of the temple is completed, Demeter sits there apart from all the blessed gods and stays there, wasting with yearning for her deep-bosomed daughter. Then the character's misfortune extends to the surrounding environment. So in the folktale, everyone falls asleep just like the princess did, whereas in the myth, nothing grows anymore. Demeter makes a cosmic winter come. So in Grimm's version, sleep extended over the whole palace and everyone fell asleep. In Demeter's myth, Demeter made a most dreadful and cruel year for mankind over the all-nourishing earth. Finally, the misfortune becomes known and powerful characters try to solve the problem, which in the fairy tale are, of course, princes, so king's sons, whereas in the myths, they are gods, Zeus' sons. And there's always a threat of death mentioned in the narrative. So in Grimm's version, king's sons, so princes, came and tried to get through the thorny hedge which had grown around the castle, But they found it impossible, and often they were caught in them, could not get loose again, and died a miserable death. And Demeter tells in the hymn, we know that Demeter wanted to destroy the race of man with famine, so to rob the Olympians of their right of sacrifices. So Zeus, concerned about this, sends all of the blessed and eternal gods to convince her to go back to heaven, but she doesn't agree, because she tells them that she will never go back to Olympus and unless she sees her daughter again. She will never let fruit spring out of the ground again. This leads to the beginning counteraction, which is function 10 in Probst's analysis, in which someone agrees to or decides upon counteraction. This is actually not very interesting. Both in the folktale and in the myth, a character agrees to counteract. In the folktale, it's a prince who decides to rescue the princess. In the myth, it's Hermes in the myth of Kore, and Hermod in the Norse myth of Baldr. I guess we can skip this. And then we have function 15, spatial transference between two kingdoms, and guidance, in which a hero is transferred, delivered, and or led to the whereabouts of an object of search. And again, Propp gives us a long list, and again, many elements are attested in our myths and folktales. The hero flies through the air on a steed, for instance, is attested both in the myths of Baldr and in the myths of Demeter. He travels on the ground on the back of a horse, myth of Baldr. The route is shown to him, Baldr's myth. But sometimes he just makes use of stationary means of communication. Sometimes he just climbs a stairway, just as it happens in the folk tales. Interestingly, the environment described in this section is always more or less explicitly associated with death. In Perrault's version, the prince just walks up to the castle and he comes into a spacious outward court where the image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. And something similar also happens in Grimm's version. In Demeter's myth, Hermes speeds down to the hidden places of the earth, and that's it. And in Baldr's myth, something more complicated happens, but in the end, Hermod comes to Hell's gates. Hell is just the realm of the dead. It's not Christian hell, it's the Norse realm of the dead. So Hermod comes to Hell's gates, and his horse jumps so hard over the gate that he comes nowhere near it. So it's his horse flies. Then we have function 19, in which the initial misfortune or lack is liquidated. This can happen in several ways. Let's discuss some more precise parallels between the folktales and the myths. The person who seeks the other person reaches the place where our character lies or sits. So in Grimm's version, the prince arrives and he sees the princess lying on the bed. In Perrault's version, the prince comes into a chamber and he sees upon a bed the sleeping beauty again. In Demeter's myth, Hermes comes into the underworld and he finds Hades, the king of the dead, in his house, lying on his bed with Kore. But lying on his bed is actually expressed by means of a formula, Emenon and Lechesi, which almost always, with no exception in the Iliad, and you only get exceptions later on, is almost always associated to death. So basically, we can translate it with Lord Hades lying on his deathbed with Kore. Baldr, also in Baldr's myth, Hermod also rides to the hall, dismounts from his steed, comes into a hall and sees sitting there his brother Baldr. Then, just like the villainy is liquidated and the character who was lying or sitting suddenly gets up, and that's what happens, or wakes up. In Grimm's version, the princess opens her eyes and wakes up. In Perrault's version, same thing. In Demeter's myth, as soon as she heard that Zeus had sent Hermes to get her back from Hades to her mother, Persephone was filled with joy and hastily sprang up for gladness. Remember that she was lying on a bed, and now she springs up for gladness. And maybe something similar is also tested in the Norse myth, but we can discuss this later. Now, this is a case of assimilation that we just discussed earlier. Now we should have the function 20 return, but what we actually have is the repeated function 15, in which there's a special transference between two kingdoms, because Cori has to reach her mother. So she has to reach her mother, and she does that by means of a horse, of horses which fly over the sea, over the waters, and over the mountain peaks. So again, we have a flying horse, a typical fairy tale motif. And of course, this leads us to, again, to the repeated function 19, in which the misfortune, this time Demeter's misfortune, not having her daughter, not being able to see her daughter, is liquidated. So first of all, the seeker reaches, so first of all, the characters reach the place where the other character lies or sits, and that's what happens in the myth, where Hermes brings Cori to the place where rich crown Demeter was staying, and then the two characters see each other, and this is a very interesting detail. They always see each other. In the folktale, the princess wakes up and looks at the prince, and in the myth, Cori and Demeter see each other and are mad with joy. So in Grimm's version, the princess opened her eyes and awoke and looked at the prince quite sweetly. And the same thing happens in Perrault's version. In Demeter's myth, Demeter saw Cori and she rushed forth. And Cori, or Persephone, when she saw her mother's sweet eyes, she ran to her and fell upon her neck and embraced her. So seeing each other is a typical element of these scenes. And then the two characters are explicitly said to spend some time enjoying each other's company. So the princess and the prince spend hours talking in love and joy. And in the myth, Cori and Demeter spend the whole day giving each other joy and love. So they talk in Perrault's version, they talked 4 hours, and they said not half of what they had to say. In Demeter's version, they had relief from their griefs, while each took and gave back joyousness. Then we have function 20, the return, in which the hero returns. So both in the folktale and in the myth, the main characters go to meet other characters, and this is connected with the return of fertility in the case of myth, and of food in the case of the folktales. So in the folktales, the princess and the prince go to meet the other inhabitants of the castle, and everyone wakes up, and the first thing they think about is eating. In the myth, Demeter goes to meet the kings of Eleusis, and she, at the same time, makes the earth fertile again. So she makes spring happen again. So in Perrault's version, all the palace awaked, and they were ready to die for hunger, and supper was served up. So the first thing they do is serving supper. And in Demeter's myth, Demeter made fruit spring up from the rich lands, and then she went to the kings who deal justice. Triptolemus and Diocles and Eumolpus and Chilius, and and she told them about her mysteries. Finally, we have the final function, which is 31, wedding, in which the hero gets married and or ascends to the throne. As Prop tells us, a bride and a kingdom are awarded at once, but sometimes, on the contrary, only accession to the throne is mentioned. In the folktales, the princess and the prince get married, as you know, whereas in the myth, Cori and Demeter, of course, cannot get married because they're mother and daughter. So they literally ascend to Olympus, where they dwell beside Zeus as powerful goddesses, which is kind of, so they basically sit on their throne in heaven. So in Grimm's version, the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose with the Sleeping Beauty was celebrated, and also in Perrault's version. In Demeter's myth, Demeter and Persephone went to Olympus, where they dwell beside Zeus, and rightly blessed is he among men on earth whom they freely love, because they are powerful goddesses, and if they love someone, they send Plutus, which means wealth, to him, to his great house. So this leads us to our final section, in which I spindles, mistletoes, and pomegranates. how to temporarily kill a sleeping beauty, which I will try to show you how all of these can help us answer questions about the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Now, in the folk tales and in the myth of Baldr, and if you believe me, in several other related Indo-European myths, the characters are pierced by an object which makes them fall asleep or die. So in Grimm's version, in the very moment when the princess felt the trick, she fell down upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And the same happens in Perrault's version. In Baldr's myth, the mistletoe twig flew through Baldr and he fell dead. So that means that from a paradigmatic perspective, so a functional perspective, things that can be substituted for one another without altering the structure of the narrative, the piercing objects in the folk tale, so the spindle, and in the Baldr myth, so the mistletoe twig, fulfill the same function. They have the same function, which is to cause the sleep or death of the main character. However, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, this is completely absent. Kore is, so the earth is said to gape open, and Kore is taken down to the house of Hades, who makes her taste a pomegranate. Now, both the first and the second element actually reflect Greek figurative expressions for death, as you can see in the passage, in the cited passage. So, in which someone wishes that the earth would gape for someone, if only I could see him go down to the house of Hades. So this whole passage just means if only he would die. So if you wish that the earth gapes for someone and that he goes down to the house of Hades, you're wishing him death. So what about the pomegranate? Why does Hades make Kore taste a pomegranate? As in this passage, but Hades secretly gave to Kore a sweet pomegranate seed to eat to prevent her from staying forever with Demeter. Now, the sleeping beauty, the sleep of Sleeping Beauty is the reflex of a well-known folktale motif, magic sleep or temporary death, which is in Steve Thompson's index is D1364. From a paradigmatic perspective, so functional perspective, we could analyze Kore's winter death, so the fact that Kore has to spend winter in the underworld, so in the realm of the dead, so she is, in a matter of speaking, temporarily dead during winter. So if we do this, if we analyze Kore's winter death as a temporary death, it is possible that the pomegranate fulfills the same function of the piercing objects of the folk tales, so of the spindle, and of the myth of Baldr, so the mistletoe. Indeed, a Spanish folklorist, Camarena Losirica, has, among others, has noticed how the magic sleep motif of Sleeping Beauty closely matches another famous folk tale, Snow White, which is classified as ATU 709. And Snow White, in its most famous version, for instance, in Disney's version, as you all know, magically falls asleep after eating an apple. But Propp himself, in another book of his, tells us that there are three main groups of objects which cause temporary death. And these are piercing objects like needles, thorns, and spindles, fruit, like apples, or pears, or grapes. That's what Propp tells us. But Propp is was a Russian scholar who worked on Russian fairy tales. And the Encyclopédie des Märchens, the encyclopedia of the fairy tale, tells us that apples and cherries are indeed predominant in the folk tales of large parts of Europe, but figs, pomegranates, and oranges have the same function in the Mediterranean area. And indeed, some names of Mediterranean versions of Snow White are the Southern Italian version Granatina, pomegranate, or the North African Jewish Arabic version Romana, which also means pomegranate. And there's even a Bedouin version, which means in which the name is pomegranate seed. So if we add to the equation the fact that there seems to be an association in Greek between apples and pomegranates, as for instance attested by the formulaic verse ochkanai kai roiai kai meleai, pears and pomegranate and apples, my possible conclusion is that the reason why Hades made Kore eat a pomegranate seed, which results in her temporary winter death, is indeed the reflex of a folktale motif, the same folktale motif which occurs in Snow White, namely fruit causes temporary death or magic sleep. So the pomegranate of Demeter and Corys myth can be analyzed as paradigmatically and functionally equivalent to the piercing objects in Perrault and Grimm's folktales, so the spindles, and in Baldr's myth, so the mistletoe twig. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riccardo. That was wonderful. Very clear also in the tracing of the parallel functions. Let's see, I'm going to change here to, I'm going to stop your screen sharing and show everyone here so that we can have a conversation. Does anyone have any questions off the bat? Riccardo, you answered the questions that I was coming up with as your presentation proceeded, so
maybe you saw that we had an example of a simulation during the presentation.
Yeah, later on. Yeah, and I was going to ask you about the corpus of folk tales that Prop used, but you said it was only Russian fairy tales that he used as his material.
Yeah, he used right? he used Afanasyev collection of Russian fairy tales, but these fairy tales all have close parallels in other international folk tales. So the corpus that Vladimir Prop used, at least European fairy tales. So his conclusions are probably can be used also for fairy tales from at least other parts of Europe, and there are actually works that demonstrate that his methodology can also be applied to, for instance, African, South African fairy tales, but also other cultures as well. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill.
You mentioned early on that possibly this structural analysis would help us better interpret the individual tales. What does this add to our knowledge of each of the individual tales?
It helps us to puts them in a framework which allows us to understand why things happen in a specific order and why specific elements happen instead of other elements. So why we have a spindle instead of a pomegranate. Of course, it's only a starting point for which can be developed further, but it definitely helps us understand the structure of these narratives, which otherwise they would all seem like different tales, and they are, of course, but they are also all share the same basic structure. I hope that answers a little bit.
Yes, it does. I just thought the hymn of Demeter is Aleutian Mysteries, a whole bunch of the heroization of Demophon, a whole lot of stuff like that, and probably Baldr's story is too. But yeah, you're right. It's a good start. Thanks.
That's a great point. Thank you. Actually, I should make it clear that I personally use several other methodologies when I analyze the Homeric hymn to Demeter. This is only one. And so this can tell us a lot about specific aspects of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, but it definitely is not the only way to analyze the Homeric hymn to Demeter. You mentioned the mysteries. You cannot analyze the Homeric hymn to Demeter if you don't take into account the Eleusinian mysteries. And the Eleusinian mysteries have, I guess, nothing to do with fairy tales. So this approach has it's only an approach to a part, an aspect of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, not to the whole, or to the myth of Baldr, not to the whole myth, not to the whole narrative, not to the whole text. Each aspect has to be approached by means of a specific methodology. Today we only discussed these traditional narrative, traditional storytelling elements, which can be actually Prop's methodology is not even the only one to approach these storytelling elements, but it is one. And it is, of course, not the right methodology to approach mentions in the Homeric hymn to Demeter to the Eleusinian mysteries, which, as you rightly noticed, are plenty. So yeah, but for instance, it can definitely help us. In the analysis, because we can at least understand which elements are more depend on the fairy tale aspects, and which elements instead can be reflexes of ritual practice. So I see them as complementary methodologies, not as alternatives. Thanks.
I think I saw someone else's hand. Maria Eugenia.
Okay, thank you for this presentation, Riccardo. My question is more hermeneutical than structural, in the sense that these days, for me, account for time order and of the cosmos of the world. So I would like to know if it would be possible to bring into this discussion the Sanskrit word for truth, rta, and think of the relation of this root r in Greek words, for instance, arete, in the sense of an underlying idea of an articulated cosmic order, that the truth is called, in a sense, to discover by retelling these myths or tales, and by that, in this the passage from death to life, or sleepness to awakeness, or darkness to light, has an important role and a very significant role. What do you think? It would be possible to do to think from that angle too?
Which angle specifically? Sorry,
that this passage that we see in all these tales and myths, from darkness to light. You mentioned the names of many characters that implies the sun, and this passage from the darkness to the death to life, the sleepness to awakeness. Can we connect to that idea of a cosmic articulated order of the world that these days discover, in the sense that when we retell this myth or the tales, we are making a sense to run the word correctly. I mean,
this is that's
yes. No, it is not so structurally, it's not so. It's you take your presentation in a structural way, angle, and I am asking for an hermeneutical one.
I see. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Well, right now I'm just I'm just working on the structure. So I'm basically working on how to analyze, how to describe, how to distinguish between the different elements of the. So I haven't really been asking myself these kind of questions, which are, I would say, the next level of interpretation. So the first thing in research is to find your data, and in my case, what I'm doing is right now is trying to understand the function of the data that I have, so the single sections, the single elements of the Homeric hymn, through this methodology. But later on, these one could apply this kind of methodology, this kind of perspective as well, of course. So I can't really say anything from as a scholar. I mean, as of my research, I can't really give an answer to your question. Give an answer to your question. But I definitely think that the attitude to respect a specific ritual, the order of things in rituals and in narratives is an already Indo-European, prehistoric, and therefore also Greek prehistoric feature. So things were told in a specific order, just like rituals were performed in a specific order, because, as you said, there's a cosmic order, which is the right order. It's the order of things in the universe, and that's not at all only in the European. It's probably universal, but definitely not just in the European. But as you said, arete, the Greek word arete, which has several cognates in other Indo-European languages, and which all connect the idea of the correct order, the correct way to do things with this root, which literally means to fit. So everything has to fit in a specific slot, basically. So I personally believe that, but I can't really, I haven't really done much research on that myself. So, but it's definitely an interesting perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I found this approach really interesting, and particularly in a comparative sense, and taking these elements. And so I was wondering, I'm thinking about ways that we might perhaps adopt some of this methodology and apply it to some of the other myths that we may be looking at, perhaps in other Homeric hymns, or very ambitiously, some of us are reading the Odyssey at the moment, which has so many episodes. So when you were approaching the Homeric hymn to Demeter, you mentioned that there were several episodes, and that, as it were, the initial starting point wasn't necessarily right at the beginning of the hymn. How would you advise somebody to go about identifying where you start these episodes, and sort of identifying which groups and or repetitions happen when you're maybe working on something a bit more complex? Not that I'm going to start with anything too huge, perhaps with a smaller thing, but how would you go about kind of picking out those repeat elements, and which is your main starting point, and so on?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great question. Well, first of all, trust philologists. So I studied philology first before going into comparative philology and linguistics and studies. I actually studied Greek philology and Latin philology. So the first thing you should do is always trust the philologists. And the truth is, they always already, by means of the philological approach, were able to distinguish specific episodes. For instance, in the case of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, this division in 3 episodes is not has been noticed by other people, other scholars who, to the best of my knowledge, haven't applied appropriate analysis to the Homeric hymn to Demeter. In some cases, it is actually quite easy. Especially in the case of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it's quite easy, because it's clear that you have an initial episode in which Demeter tries to find out what has happened to her daughter, and then you have the Demophon episode, which is so clearly which can clearly be distinguished from the rest of the of the plot, so much that many have actually seen it as a some sort of interpolation, as something that wasn't originally there. And at some point, the Demophon episode is over. So, and the characters of the Demophon episode are not there anymore. So you don't have Demophon, you don't have Metaneira, you don't have Keleos anymore. And then you understand that the third episode is started. So basically, it's pretty clear in some cases. As for the other Homeric hymns, I actually have started working on the others, especially on the Homeric hymn to Hermes, and you do have you can apply similar structures there as well. The way I guess that there are three possible approaches. You can either use the Propian approach, according to which each episode has to follow specific functions in a specific order. So you recognize a new episode, for instance, by a new act of villainy. If a new act of villainy happens, you have a new episode. Or you can use other means, and also, of course, you can use oral traditional poetics, oral theory. You can try to isolate specific traditional features like type scenes or themes. For instance, you mentioned the Odyssey and the Iliad. Well, the Odyssey and the Iliad, for what I know, they haven't been fully analyzed from a Propian perspective, but they have been cited. They have been actually compared to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, because they are by a scholar West who recognized a parallel structure called withdrawal and return. Both in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where Demeter withdraws, so she leaves the company of the gods, and at some point she returns, and then meanwhile the cosmos, the universe, doesn't function anymore. And that's basically the same thing that happens in the Iliad, with Achilles leaving the Greek army and leading to Patroclus' death and so on. And also in the Odyssey, with Odysseus being gone from Ithaca and so on. So, of course, there are much longer texts which are much harder to analyze from these perspectives. But
there are specific smaller episodes within those, or individual stories of individual, say, fighters in the Iliad, or so forth. So they would be kind of small, self-contained sections, like which we might compare to the Demophon episode in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, for example.
Yeah, I definitely think that for specific sections it could be useful. Of course, this is a sort of narratological approach. Prop is one of the founders of the science of narratology, and of course there are narratological analysis of the Iliad and the Odyssey by, for instance, de Jong, Irene de Jong. So there are other narratological approaches that one can use in dealing with these texts. Remember that the Propian methodology was developed on fairy tales, so and not everything is a fairy tale. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ian, go ahead. This will be our last question, I think, given the time.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Just curious if you've looked into what we might think of as some sort of structural inversion in the two fairy tales, in the Baldr or Baldr myth, after the I guess the prophecy of doom, and the gods, I guess, try and get oaths from all the various plants and animals, but they actively then throw all these things at the character, and then in the end, the attempt to get him from the underworld is unsuccessful. Whereas in the Sleeping Beauty myth, they actively attempt to eliminate the spindles from the environment, and in the end, the Sleeping Beauty is awakened. Is there any other? Do you see any sort of, I guess, inverted parallels or any other functions or structures in those myths?
Thank you very much. So you can definitely see inversions, sort of inversions, or differences between these narratives. So in this specific case, I don't really know if that would count as an inversion, because in the fairy tale, the attempt to make the princess invulnerable is actually not successful. So these attempts to make someone invulnerable, immortal, to avoid death are always not successful. So the royal decree that makes that destroys all the spindles in the kingdom is unsuccessful, because some old woman in some room of the castle, in the end, she does have a spindle, and she spins, and the princess eventually pricks herself with the spindle. So what makes the princess come back from her eternal sleep is actually either time, because she had been cursed to sleep for 100 years, or the prince coming, as you probably know, kissing her in some versions, or worse in others. So there's no connection between the attempt to destroy all the spindles in the kingdom and the eventual and the final awakening of the princess. But indeed, it is. I do agree with you that the myth of Baldr has this strange passage about the gods. So for anyone who doesn't recall, after Frigg makes Baldr invulnerable, instead of enjoying this invulnerability, they enjoy too much. Basically, they make Baldr the center of a weird game in which they throw weapons at him, so swords or arrows and everything, and they try to hurt him. And of course, nothing can hurt him because he has been made invulnerable by his mother. But just like in the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, these royal decrees or these oaths, which are supposed to make someone invulnerable, never actually work. In the end, there is one single thing that can hurt Baldr. It's the mistletoe, which was Frigg, so the goddess Baldr's mother. She thought it was too small to hurt Baldr, so she never asked the mistletoe to not hurt Baldr. But in the end, it is, of course, the mistletoe which kills Baldr. So that is a strange passage. But I think this is an example of what the first question was about. So I think this is an example of something that cannot be explained, or at least at the moment, I don't really see a connection with the fairy tale. I actually see a connection with a ritual here. I see a connection with a ritual, which is a longer discussion, but I think there are traces of a ritual here. Actually, this has been already noticed by many other scholars who have worked on the myth of Baldr, for instance, Fraser. And I think this has a parallel in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, but again, it's not a fairy tale parallel, it's a ritual parallel. It's a parallel in the Homeric hymn to Demeter when Demeter mentions this ritual in which the youths of Eleusis will fight with one another. So this is a reference to a specific ritual, a mock battle which was connected with the passing of yearly rituals, fertility rituals, and you have examples of these mock battles all over the world, or at least all over Europe in this case, and both the Greek ritual and the Norse and the passage of the Norse myth, they have both been connected with this kind of rituals. So this might be an example of what we were saying before. Within this fairy tale structure, at some point you have this element which has nothing to do with the fairy tale, but it was added because it's a reference to ritual. So and it should be analyzed with a methodology which with a specific methodology which can approach this kind of ritual references to ritual. So not Propian analysis, but I might be wrong on this. Of course, my research is still ongoing, so it's still possible that I see that there is some kind of inversion here, and that maybe I don't see it yet, but I will in the future. So thank you a lot for your comment.
Fascinating, thank you.
All right, Riccardo, thanks so much. That was wonderful. It's a very illuminating glimpse into these fairy tales. So thanks to the rest of you for joining us. And see you next time, when actually our speaker will be Masha, who is in attendance. But that's for the future. Okay, signing off.